Hi, I'm Hudson. I'm a game designer and I occasionally make videos. I want to talk about Path of Exile 2, specifically the Warrior. The Warrior is a strength-based fighter that primarily uses maces and shields. He presently has three Ascendancy classes, the Titan, the Warbringer, and the Smith of Kitava. His mace skills focus on large, powerful strikes and increasing survivability. I like being a tank, and I like the playstyle of fighter classes, but warrior classes tend to be boring, and while this warrior is also kind of boring, he at least has his own flavor. A spicy flavor, a lot of fires involved. The warrior has a good variety of skills that include attacks, buffs, and debuffs. He has the ability to strike large areas, ignite enemies, break enemy armor, and block incoming attacks. I didn't feel like anything in particular was missing from his toolkit, although I did feel like the order that skills become available was a little weird. Sometimes a skill that I wanted or expected to have wasn't available until later, and that made me feel like an essential part of my toolkit was missing until then. Let's talk about the skills that I spent the most time with. Earthquake deploys an effect that slows enemies within it and then erupts after a delay to deal damage in an area. Here's yet another skill that has a delay before it actually does anything. I can literally deploy this earthquake and kill every enemy around me before it even erupts. So what the hell is the point? Why would I ever need to use this skill? Earthquake has an interesting synergy with Shockwave Totem. The Shockwave Totem slams the ground, repeatedly damaging enemies around it, and Earthquake erupts when struck by that slam. But in the time that I've set up that combo and deployed both skills, I could have just beat the shit out of every enemy around me. I understand what the designers are trying to do here, and it's very much appreciated. I do prefer more interesting gameplay to just bashing enemies in the face repeatedly. And it is admittedly more fun to set up this combo, and the fun factor is obviously important. But efficiency is also important, and in every instance in which I've tried this combo, it was inefficient. I don't want to feel like I'm doing something wrong or something that isn't optimal. Next, let's talk about Bone Shatter. When an enemy is close to being stunned, Bone Shatter will stun them immediately and damage nearby enemies. I always throw out skills that trigger when an enemy is close to something, like being slain or stunned. This mechanic always feels like an interruption to normal gameplay. I can always just kill enemies faster than I can trigger whatever the effect is, and enemies are usually killed before I can trigger the effect anyway. This is true of Bone Shatter and any effect that culls an enemy. It's usually a waste of time that could be better spent on another more useful skill or action. In fact, getting this skill to trigger reliably was so difficult that I could only get it to happen once, so get a good look at it, because it's not going to happen again. Shield Charge allows you to rush forward, damaging enemies along your path. While you're charging, your shield is raised and you will block incoming attacks. I like Shield Charge. It's a useful skill that allows you to close the gap on distant enemies. My only complaint is that it's so useful and so powerful that it overshadows other skills. Additionally, it can be steered. However, sometimes it can be unruly and difficult to hit your intended target. Armor Breaker is a melee strike that knocks back enemies and weakens their armor, which lowers their damage reduction. I like that skills like this exist, skills that serve a specific purpose. A skill doesn't always need to deal the most damage to be useful. Resonating Shield repeatedly emits shockwaves around you that reduce enemy armor. While Resonating Shield is active, your shield is raised and you will block incoming attacks. I really like this skill. It looks good and it feels good to use. And its damage, while low compared to other skills, is still high enough to be useful. But this skill shares the same problem that many skills like Earthquake have. It feels like a waste of time. Reducing enemy armor does make them easier to defeat, but I could just defeat them with brute force in approximately the same amount of time. Infernal Cry empowers your next attack, and empowers additional attacks by consuming endurance charges. It also destabilizes enemies, causing them to combust when they're slain. This is another useful skill that doesn't overshadow any other skills. It gives the player a little boost to their damage, but in a concise way, and it rewards the player for doing exactly what they should be doing, slaying enemies. Molten Blast launches Molten Rock at enemies. The projectile explodes on impact, damaging enemies and scattering shrapnel in a cone behind it. I like Molten Blast. I like the way it looks and feels. I like that the warrior has his own form of ranged attack that matches his flavor. But, yet again, there's a delay. The warrior does this little twirl before every throw. And it's cool, it looks great, but it's slow, and repeated uses of this skill compound together. Perfect Strike charges up your weapon. When you release at the perfect moment, you will unleash a wave of fire. This is yet another skill in a very large group of skills that wastes the player's time. The player isn't doing anything else while they're charging up this skill, and if the player doesn't release it at exactly the right moment, nothing happens. So it may not even be a worthwhile payoff for the investment. The perfect moment exists within a tiny window of opportunity, making it difficult to even accomplish. I found that I had to anticipate the perfect moment and release before I even saw it, otherwise I would miss it. And you may as well give up if your timing is altered by a slowing effect like chill. Additionally, depending on what's happening on screen, it's difficult to even see the opportunity. Next, let's talk about the passive skills. I find it strange that there are no passive nodes that provide maximum life. I understand that strength inherently provides maximum life, but intelligence provides maximum mana, and there are still passive nodes that also provide that. In general, the strength area of the passive tree feels a little lacking. Maybe that's because the warrior is more straightforward than other classes, but the nodes feel a lot less imaginative and a lot more clinical, and I expected to see more. Perhaps it's just the way stats are worded, but it feels like something's missing. There are a lot of nodes for armor and melee damage, but there are no nodes for maximum life, damage resistance, move speed, weapon swap, presence radius. In summary, I liked the warrior. Melee combat doesn't feel terrible, but it definitely doesn't feel very good much of the time. The pacing of the game is a little different than other ARPGs. It's slower and more deliberate, and that isn't a problem. It feels a little weird at first, but I quickly adjusted to it. However, I noticed that melee combat in particular starts to break down when there are more enemies on screen. It's very easy for the player to become quickly surrounded, and there really is no other option at that point other than to take the beating to the face or continually roll away. This is the swarming complaint that I mentioned in my previous video. Being overwhelmed in this way feels terrible. It doesn't make me feel powerful or heroic, it's just frustrating. I'm here to slay monsters, not get punched in the face and roll around. Additionally, many actions are very deliberate and require a particular level of precision. Blocking in particular felt like it never worked until I realized that I have to actually face enemies when they were attacking. But when there are several enemies surrounding you, it's much more difficult to accurately block enemy attacks. And that makes sense, but that doesn't mean it's appropriate for this kind of game. It doesn't feel good and it isn't fun. This is a good example of the duality that I've mentioned previously. The designers of the game want to make an ARPG, but they also want to make a Souls-like, and those two genres do not easily intermingle. On the one hand, there are many enemies that must be dispatched quickly, and on the other hand, combat is slow and deliberate. Getting that right requires a lot of fine-tuning, and I don't believe that's been properly figured out yet. So those are my thoughts on the warrior. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.